Hello there, Drew Hanish of Whiskey Lore, and time for another whiskey tasting. Today, doing a tasting of a whiskey that was suggested to me by someone in the liquor store. I was actually going to walk out of the liquor store without purchasing anything because I think I've gotten to a point where if I'm going to spend some money on whiskey, I have a lot of whiskey in my cabinet, and so it's time to really start thinking I'll spend extra on the stuff I really, really want and stop buying value whiskey. So what happens? Walk out on a suggestion with a value whiskey. And not only a value whiskey, but a value whiskey that comes in this mammoth 1.75 liter jug. And I have a couple of whiskeys like this. Old Forester I bought that way. I bought Rebel Yell that way. I don't like buying whiskey in this large a quantity unless it's going to end up being something that I'm going to put in my decanter. But this was $29 and it came so highly recommended. I said, okay, I got to give it a shot because there's not a lot of value scotches that I do reviews on. I did one on Johnny Walker Red, which I think is a whiskey that starts out very interesting. Love the butterscotch notes in it, but then it kind of goes wrong on the finish. Then there's Shackleton, which I think is an exceptional blended malt whiskey and one that I highly recommend. In fact, you're going to be very interested, I think, in hearing at the end of this episode what a friend of mine thinks Shackleton relates to, which is a much higher priced whiskey. But I bought White Horse. I didn't want to. I am curious about this whiskey because of a couple of things. One, I love the founder of this whiskey, a guy named Peter Mackey, who has ties to Laphroaig and Lagavulin. He was working sales for Laphroaig, got into a dispute, went over to Lagavulin, and which is right next door, and decided to create a competing whiskey and built the Malt Mill Distillery, which is something you can still go see today. There's no distillery equipment in it. But if you're doing a tour of Lagavulin, when you end up in the place where you get to do some samples, guess what? That is where in the little cafe, that is what used to be the Malt Mill Distillery. So some fun history there. Peter Mackey, I talk about him in my Whiskey Lore Stories episode about Campbelltown because he owned a distillery there. He owned some other distilleries as well, although he's remembered as a blender. And he actually got out of the business in the 1920s because his son died in World War I and he just never got over it and pretty much just gave up at that point. His brand, White Horse, which comes in this I know this is history and they're wanting to stick with history, but this is to me one of the least appealing bottles on the shelf, and I'm just like, I don't want to buy it. But you know what? I mean, the history guy in me probably should appreciate that they haven't fudged with this too much. It is owned by Diageo. Diageo has evolved over time. It was Distillers Company Limited way back when they were a grain distilling company that was prevalent in the 1800s. They bought up all the distilleries that were dying off after the Paterson crash in 1898, and then they went into Ireland, bought some of those distilleries as well. They were a thorn in the side of the Big Four in Dublin. So many historical ties. You could see why I ended up buying a bottle of this. They basically turned into Guinness and then into Diageo. And because this is filled with Diageo juice, we're talking about some great distilleries in Scotland. And when I was sold this bottle of whiskey, I was told, well, you need to buy that if you like Caol Ila because it has Kalila in it as one of its main components. Well, then I got home and I did some reading on it, and it said, no, it has Lagavulin as one of its main components. And then I read some more, and somebody else said, no, it has Talisker as one of its main components. I'm almost more in the camp of thinking it is something like Talisker rather than Kalila or Lagavulin, simply because it doesn't have as much of a smoke note to it as, I mean, it doesn't take a lot of a smoky whiskey to be blended in to take over a whiskey. And this is smoky, but it's not that smoky. And so I was kind of nosing it to see if I could pick out exactly what it was. And I will tell you that this on the nose comes at you as much with an apple kind of a note to me, that apple pear combination, meaning it's probably coming from some of the Speyside distilleries, maybe a lowland distillery in here, but there is a light smoke, a light matchstick kind of a smoke coming through on this. Little toffee coming in. Before I dig in and do a tasting on this, I want to clear something up. If you look at this bottle, you will see that it says the White Horse Cellar established 1742. Now, you may think that this whiskey was established in 1742, but in reality, Mackie named it after a inn in Edinburgh that actually disappeared somewhere around the time that he, not too long after, he came up with this whiskey called the White Horse. And so that is where the name comes from for White Horse. And the date on here is for that inn rather than for the whiskey. Like I say, lots of history. So for an inexpensive Scotch, this has a lot going on the nose. So let's jump on the palate, see what happens here. Cheers. So my main complaint with this whiskey is that it is proofed down too much. It is 40%. And I understand this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get a value whiskey. Honestly, I would rather pay the same price for a 700 ml bottle, which is less than half of this, but give me a proof at 46% or higher. Because I will tell you, the only thing I have against this whiskey is it's thin. Other than that, this is a really good value whiskey. In the scheme of whiskeys, I would say that this is unfortunately just an okay whiskey, not higher than that if we're talking about all whiskeys, and mainly because of the thin character of this whiskey. It starts off feeling like it's got oils and things that are going to make this heavier on the palate, but it's thin. It just thins right out. I think what gives that impression is that toffee note that carries right from the nose into the palate to the finish. The smokiness is there, but it's not overbearing, and that's why, again, I say I think this is gently aged with something like a Lagavulin or Kalila, but more likely something like a Talisker that has a smoky character to it, but it's not, overbearing. But I'm trying to think which Diageo malt has more of a matchstick kind of a character to it, because there's Talisker usually makes me think more on the side of like that briny character, and there may be a little bit of that in here, but not quite as much as you would think. And then when it finishes, there is a bit of ginger that comes in, and it doesn't taste 100% right to me. it tastes a little bit off, but just a little bit. And so it's such a small complaint on this whiskey that it really almost does push me, even with me saying that this is thin and that takes it down to okay. I say, you know what? I mean, I want to say this is a good whiskey. I just wish that they would do a higher ABV on it. But for $29, if you want to have a smoky whiskey around, I don't think they sell this so much over in Scotland and Ireland and that area. But if you're in the US, you should be able to find this. I know they sell it in Japan as well and some other areas. So interesting whiskey. A lot of history. I'm glad I bought it, actually, even though it'll probably take me 3 years to get through this bottle. But, I mean, this is one that, again, if I invite people over and we're doing some tastings and they say, well, what would you consider to be a value Scotch that you would recommend? If you're looking for value, you don't want to spend a lot of money, this is a very interesting whiskey. But it's going to come at you with that smoky note. So if you haven't quite trained yourself into liking smoky whiskeys yet, or you got a sweet tooth, it may be a little bit off-putting for you. But to me, this almost gets into that smoky caramel kind of a experience. It's just extremely thin. It's like the same, some of the same notes that you get out of Glenglassa, but it's just thin. So this is just way too thin for me. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Hope you learned something from it. Honestly, I wouldn't turn you away from a bottle of this if you wanted to get a cheap bottle of Scotch on your shelf. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you'd like to, like the video so other people get attracted to the Whiskey Lore channel and start watching these videos, I appreciate that. Leave your comments if you like. Have you tried White Horse? What do you think? And subscribe if you want to see more videos. Until next time, cheers and Slanjava. A little vanilla in there too. This is a very heavily bourbon cask influenced whiskey, definitely.